Everyone. Thank you for joining us this lovely afternoon. Actually, before we start, I'm going to hook in my earphones one more time. Yeah. My name is Carlos Ballesteros. I'm a reporter with Injustice Watch in Chicago, and I'll be the moderator for this panel on immigration and FOIA and how these two things intersect. And hopefully we leave today with some valuable tips and strategies, as well as the inevitable kind of like war stories in securing some documents that could shed some light as to how you can get some documents. So as the other sessions, as with the other sessions, FOIA Fest, we will leave time for questions at the end. So please feel free to drop them at in the chat as we go along, or you can save them till the end and then drop them in the chat. Up to you. And we have some very, very lovely and intelligent panelists for us today, and I will let them introduce themselves. And I did like a randomizer thing before today, and Adriana, you came up first. So go from Adriana to Chelsea and then Sarah.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Carlos. Hi, everybody. My name is Adriana Rezal. I'm currently a data fellow with U.S. News and World Report for the news department. And prior to being with U.S. News, I worked in Chicago for the summertime. I'm currently based in Houston. And so I was in Chicago with Borderless magazine doing a reporting internship. And so I had the summer to learn about immigration reporting and local reporting in the Midwest, as well as for Chicago. And that's where I got to meet Chelsea. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm Chelsea Verstegen. I'm currently a contributing reporter for Borderless, and Borderless's mission is to tell refugee and immigration stories across the Midwest with, a very human approach. So I've had a really interesting about year and a half with them and wrote some really cool stories about different immigrant and refugee stories and personas that we've gotten to talk about. And so it's been really great. And yeah, meeting and working with Adriana was one of the plus sides for sure.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm an attorney with the National Immigrant Justice Center, which is a large immigration nonprofit based in Chicago, although I'm based in San Diego because most of my work focuses on the border and border issues. So I FOIA various immigration agencies in this role and in past roles as well.
Thank you. And yeah, just one more time, my name is Carlos. Cover immigration for Injustice Watch here in Chicago. Have used FOIA before, but I've not been too successful, at least when it comes to immigration stuff. So as with you, the audience, I'm very, very curious and eager to learn today. And, right before we jump in, I think it's important to note that when it comes to immigration stories, a lot of the times we're dealing with federal agencies and federal procedures, but there's also a big intersection, especially when it comes to detention and things that get people in trouble with immigration, that involve very local agencies from counties to the state, and there are other intersections too. So this topic, while it does kind of revolve around federal policy, and ultimately I think is like it's framed by federal policy in a lot of ways. It's not just ICE, CBP, USCIS. So we're hoping to kind of touch on these points as we go along today. And so I think I wanted to start out this conversation with kind of one what to expect when asking for these kinds of records from these kinds of agencies. And considering that perhaps not all of us in this chat, in this panel, or in this conversation tuning in, are know this, but there are several immigration agencies that deal with immigration records. There's ICE, which I think is probably maybe the most famous or the most recognizable. Then you have USCIS, which deals with a lot of naturalization services. Then you have CBP, which is at the border and other areas of the country, airports and stuff, customs. And so there are a lot of agencies to untangle here. And so my first question for you, Sarah, goes to kind of generally speaking, what has been your experience sending record requests to these agencies, these federal agencies, both as an attorney, but also as a policy advocate?
Sarah, I think you're muted.
Oh, Sarah, you are muted.
Sorry, I thought I clicked it. Thank you. My experience has generally been not great, I would say. I don't think I've ever gotten records without a fight. I think normally we do the requests and we prepare them and send them in very much expecting to litigate them. And that's an internal conversation we have all the time, is when we want to file something, if we will have resources and have an end goal that will make us want to actually have to go to court over this, because we often do. And in terms of which agencies, Carlos, that was a great kind of breakdown of them. I think also sometimes you don't have control over which agency is handling your FOIA request, because what happens often is I will think that the documents I want are in the hands of one agency, and then, and this, I think, in my opinion, is an intentional tactic to, stymie the FOIA requester, but they'll often refer your request kind of back and forth between the different agencies, playing hot potato to prevent you from actually getting access to them. So sometimes I end up fighting with an agency that I did not really expect to.
That's an interesting point, Sarah. Do you then perhaps, have you relented, or have you just decided to maybe send the request to all the agencies as kind of like to make sure that they all get it? Or do you have to wait and see as they pinball it between each other?
Kind of a mix. I think different people probably have different practices on that. And I'd be curious as to, the journalistic approach to this, because of course also, lawyers sometimes are so like myopic towards litigation. And so I think we're sort of always thinking about it. Oh, who's going to be the defendant, who, we want to be targeting. But I think in the past too, I would always send paper copies to all the different agencies, but now it is with all, especially with DHS, Homeland Security, they have consolidated now into a kind of more general FOIA portal. So a lot of the time I have stopped sending it to the different agencies, because then also you get different tracking numbers. And I think that then makes it easier for them to obfuscate as well.
Right. So ultimately, I think your request is at their discretion, and to even if you try to perhaps skip this kind of step or circumvent it, it's kind of inevitable. So is there something you can do, or something that you've learned to do before sending out this request, to kind of figure out which agency it is that you want to request these records from? Or even in the kind of most prepared, kind of most confident scenario where you thought you were for sure, like it still ended up not being the right agency?
I don't think there's a way to fully know. I mean, sometimes I'm doing FOIAs on behalf of my individual clients that I'm representing in deportation proceedings, because we don't get their files. And so that, that usually is a little more predictable which agencies are going to carry which information. But when I'm doing the more policy-oriented FOIAs, I'll always try to guess, and I'll address it to a particular agency that I think is most likely to. But sometimes it is very surprising. But also sometimes the surprises are educational in themselves, and one agency is not keeping records on a particular topic that I would assume they would have, and it actually is under the purview of a different agency, which kind of sometimes gives me a window into their thought process on record keeping.
That's a very important point. I think there was another panel, I forget which one, from yesterday, that touched on this exact point about the surprises being the story as well. Like, to your point, if an agency is not tracking something that you think it should be tracking, then that perhaps is the story in itself. And Sarah, just lastly on this point, you mentioned at the beginning that that it is always a fight, and that you kind of expect litigation to get the records you want. Is there any substantial difference between the how much you have to fight to get these records when it comes to the different agencies under DHS that you're requesting them? Like, is ICE worse than CBP, or is CBP worse than USCIS, or is it just bad across the board?
Well, the bar is very, very low. I think there are certain agencies that have much smaller backlogs, and you can actually check that online. I don't know the exact link, but if you Google backlog FOIA, then they should give you an estimate of how many requests there are pending. There are certain agencies, CBP being one of them, that was recently switched over, that have what are called national security designations, which make it much easier for them to hide information. And so those agencies, which is, CIA, FBI, which are not DHS, but now also CBP, they have a little more power to hide things. And so I would say that in my experience, CBP is one of the worst ones, but they're also one of the ones I deal with the most. So maybe I'm just a bias there. But yeah, generally all of DHS. I think some like GSA, the General Services Administration, that manage property and contracts, they're maybe a little easier because people don't really know them, but otherwise it's all bad.
It's all bad. Fantastic. Great. Love living in a democracy. Chelsea and Adriana, I think I'll leave it up to you all to decide who to take this. But I was hoping that you can link us to your story that you worked over the summer in the chat about COVID-19 spreading among ICE detainees held in Illinois jails. I was hoping you could drop the link in the chat so that folks who are tuning in can see it. Thank you, Adriana. It's in the chat now for folks watching. But yeah, maybe we'll just start with Chelsea just to make it easier. Can you talk about the story? Can you break it down for me and for us as to what you all wanted to look at and why you wanted to answer these questions? And how did FOIA come into play?
Yeah, we're going to actually tag team this one a bit, but I'll start. The story was developing to be something that we didn't start out thinking it would be about. Basically, we had this person, Florian, who the story talks about in the beginning. He had developed COVID in December of 2020. He wasn't given the means to actually be treated properly to make sure that the spread was contained. And it ended up that almost the entire detention center that he was at then developed COVID, all of the detainees. So the story became a lot bigger than we were expecting. We kind of thought we were going to just talk to Florian and have this very person-oriented story, which is what Borderless focuses on. But it very quickly became clear that there were discrepancies in the data, the way that it's being kept online on the ICE site, where you're able to see daily COVID numbers. Basically, what we did is we used the Wayback Machine to look at the past 15 months and see each day how many cases were accounted for at each detention center across the Midwest, and quickly noticed that there was a lot of discrepancies and a lot of issues with that. So that's kind of where the need for a FOIA came into play. And I'll let Adriana talk on that.
So quickly so discrepancies as in ICE was reporting a certain number of people were infected, and then you were seeing from the jail itself where people were kept that those numbers didn't match up?
So that's one example. Another is that one day it would say we had 6 cases. We have 6 active cases. The next day it would say we have 0 active cases, but it wasn't as if, they had that 2-week waiting period, which was the rule at the time. It was for 3 days they had 6 active cases, then they had 0, and those 3 days before they also had 0. So it was just either, they're misreporting or there's a bigger story there, basically, was what we were trying to get at.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah, and if I could add to that as well, I think one of the, like, from a data standpoint, one of the bigger problems that I saw was sometimes the total cases for each detention center would decrease. And usually that happens whenever a person is like transferred or like, there's a reason for that total case number to go down and not be for that detention center anymore. But it just wasn't really clear on the website why those numbers were changing. And so I think one of the bigger things to mention about this story is like how accessible and how easy it is to understand the data that you're getting from these sources. So it's great that ICE has this updated, information like table, but it's where can we access the archives of that data and like the history, historical records of that. And so I think that using the internet archiving website that we used to kind of aggregate all of that and collect it into one Excel sheet and kind of track the numbers that way was really great. And so once we started looking at that data and we started seeing these gaps, I think then that's kind of when the story became a bigger issue of, why isn't this data very accessible? Why are these big mistakes? And why isn't it very clear of why those issues are coming up? And so I think as far as like requesting the information, like you said, we worked directly with ICE to kind of ask these main questions. And my strategy in doing that was ICE has a pretty complicated request website for their FOIAs, and I'll link it there. And prior to this story, I was working with ICE on another story. And so I had already this kind of contact person that I was emailing back and forth with. And so I reached out to them and asked about this new story that I was working on. So the way that I kind of formatted that email was, again, stating my name, very obviously the story that I'm working on, the publication that I'm working for, and very clearly stating the questions and the information that I was requesting. And I think one of the main challenges in operating and working closely with ICE on things like this is that they respond back with like a statement that you've seen like on every other publication, or they just like repeat what's on their website, or they link back to the same source that you've already seen online. And so it's just kind of hard to get like an explanation from them. And so kind of, I think one of my other biggest strategies is to always, the advice that I got while working at Borderless was when requesting information, especially when it's going to be a difficult source, sometimes approaching with niceness off the bat in an email is a good way to get information, easier, especially as a journalist. We're trying to get quotes and things like that from people if we can. And so working with ICE was interesting for sure. There was a point where I had an email thread going and then I was switched to a different person. So it was kind of like a shift in the person that I was working with. And at the end of the day, we didn't get all of the questions that we needed answered. And so another big point I would say as well with working with the story is oftentimes the data that we're getting and the information that we're requesting is, like I said, hard to access or difficult to understand. And so we really used a lot of other resources when we would originally use ICE as our biggest source. We really relied on these other resources like the Wayback Machine. While I was looking at the data and seeing all these gaps, I just wanted to make sure that this was a trend that a lot of other publications were seeing. So in the article, I spoke with the Vera Institute of Justice, and they were seeing very similar patterns in what we were saying and the same issues. So it was really good to talk with them as another organization that is like experiencing this and how they're approaching it, as well as how Chelsea mentioned, speaking with Florian himself and having that kind of human element of, this is what the data is seeing, this is the issues that we're having, but what's it like inside? So that's kind of what we did with this story.
Yeah, one other thing I'll add too is we were looking at average daily population to get kind of a comparison of the daily rate that they're projecting of COVID in their centers, because without that number means nothing. You don't know how many people are being housed in each detention center. So that was really difficult to get. Like some places that we called and talked with, we had a script written out for 11 detention centers and would call and, ask, can I just get your average daily population for the last 15 months? And some people would say, yes, it's one number. Or some people would send a graph or a chart with 12 or so numbers. And then some people would say, that's not something that we can give you. You're going to have to submit a FOIA. So we got a lot of different responses from a lot of different places.
Yeah, and that's been my experience too. I my most recent story was dealing with kind of the ending of detention in Illinois, and to get the numbers of people that were there in the last few weeks at the 2 jails that held ICE detainees still also was interesting. One jail asked me to submit a FOIA request. The other jail didn't give me anything. Like I had to circumvent and find through other sources what those numbers were. But I think this is an interesting point to make, is that FOIA, I think sometimes, at least for me when I was starting out, FOIA seemed to be kind of this monumental sort of like super serious kind of endeavor. And I mean, obviously it is, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not, first of all, it's an impossible task. Don't be afraid of FOIA. I mean, the worst they can say is no. But the other thing too is that it's also there are both small and big FOIAs. Like the FOIAs for the population numbers, like that might seem like something that maybe an agency should give you off bat, particularly if they're using tax dollars to hold people in cages. But like sometimes you have to literally file a FOIA for something like, so that seems relatively small. So do it. Don't get scared away by some public information officer that tells you that you have to FOIA for it. Just be like, all right, I will, and then do it in 5 minutes. And I think that's worked for me in the past. But quickly, Chelsea and Adriana, so I just want to make clear so what exactly did you request and who did you request from? Like how did you use FOIA for that story? Because did you request ICE records? Did you FOIA ICE? Yeah.
Yeah, we did submit a FOIA to ICE for those records in the end. We were directed at times to the website, like Adriana said. We got a short sentence back that, a statement that said, this can be found on our website. And in looking at that, where they said it would be found, it was given in a very illegible, kind of almost like purposefully deceiving way. And so it wasn't really something that we could make sense of. But Adriana also submitted 10 questions and I think got maybe an answer to 1 or 2, if that.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, and I think, trying to do best practices of journalism as far as just like following up with emails and, reinstating your that you have deadlines and things like that is just the best way to go about, encouraging people to be responsive to you. But especially with an entity as big as ICE, where you're kind of getting switched around PIOs and things like that, like public information officers, and it can, you're doing the best you can. And so as long as you're diligent in doing that, then that's when you can put in the article that we did not receive a response or we did not get comment on this. And so I think that being very transparent in your reporting and your final product is also very important. But yeah, I think to reiterate that immigration is obviously a very local issue. So whether you're working with big entities like ICE or you're working with, local departments and things like that, FOIAing is just requesting information that everybody is entitled to. And so whether you're a journalist or working with an organization or just a concerned citizen, like this is all information that should be available and you should be able to request for.
I'm typing out that truth bomb you just dropped. Adriana, hold on. FOIAing is just asking for information that you're entitled to. That's right. I get that tatted across my chest. So I think this is a good point to transition into this part of the conversation where it's a bummer. Like it's very clear that it's a bummer asking for records, when it comes to this stuff. I mean, I think federal agencies are notorious in taking a long time, but it seems like immigration might be the immigration agencies might be even kind of like I don't know, the worst of the bunch. Is that too harsh? But so I want to transition us into kind of like, okay, so this is kind of status quo. So how do we get around it? Sarah, I want to ask you. You've been doing this for a while, and it seems like you've been pretty successful at it. And I just want to. I would hope that you can walk us through like some of the strategies and tips that you've picked up along the way, both for reporters, but for researchers and advocates or whoever's on this call, to kind of get through these roadblocks and get the records you know exist, but perhaps might take a while to get?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are a lot of tricks or just kind of strategies that can go into it. I know I just said that you have to litigate, but I don't think that's true. I think you just have to be really persistent. As you know, Chelsea and Adriana were just describing their process. I think there are a few things. Probably the most common roadblock that I face in my FOIA and transparency work is they say, unless I'm doing a really targeted FOIA for one particular document that I know exists and that I can name, or one particular stat, if I'm doing the kind of broader FOIAs, they'll say, your request is so burdensome, it's going to take us 50 years to finish producing all this, et cetera, et cetera. And when I get something like that, I mean, sometimes I will narrow the request because it depends on what my goals are. If I do want to actually get something quickly, then I will sometimes agree. I'll negotiate with the FOIA officer and agree to narrow. But even when I do that, or if I don't want to do that, I think the internet is your friend. There are so many resources. I always look at different FOIA repositories across the internet. Like, there's so many organizations that publish big databases, both of FOIA documents, but also kind of the letters they wrote back and forth with privacy officers in the appeal process. And so you can look at, oh, that person made this argument, that's relevant to my point, I'm going to say that too. But also, if you look at documents that are already out there, then you can get a better idea of the specifics of what you're looking for. And then they can't say that your request is overbroad and vague and whatever, because you're like, well, I know this exists and this is what I want. The other thing, in addition to those big FOIA repositories that I use all the time, is that so under the Privacy Act, all federal agencies have to publish these two. This is a deep nerd FOIA cut, but they all have to publish these two types of announcements, basically, that they're called PIAs and SORNs. It's privacy impact assessments, and SORN is system of records notices. And what those basically are is that every time a federal agency wants to create a new system of records or a new database or take an action that affects privacy of US citizens in any way, and that includes surveillance, anything like that, they have to publish these very, very detailed descriptions of what this software program initiative is. And so I will really often go in, think about when I know a little bit at this point about the different databases that DHS agencies use, but then I'll often cross-reference, go back and look at the PIA or the SORN from when it first was started. And then I can say, oh, I know exactly that you're keeping this type of information in this field, in this software, because you had to publish it and you need to give me that.
Where can you find the PIA and SORN stuff?
I can link, I should have pulled that up already, but I can drop a link in the chat.
Yeah. See, I'm telling you, I'm learning so much already. That's fantastic. I think that's a great recommendation, to be confident in what you're asking about, and really kind of like being sure that what you're asking exists. Because I think then the workaround is tough on their end. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Very cool. And I think, and secondly, so I also wanted to ask you another kind of technical question. What do you use to keep track of your record requests when dealing with immigration agencies?
We just use it. In NIJC, we just use a spreadsheet where we have we keep track of the request, the tracking number, a small summary of the request, and then any correspondence that we've had with the FOIA officer, which we also will save the emails to our drive, but we'll always keep a spreadsheet so that we can kind of get a timeline at first glance. And then we have them all in a row sorted by categories and all that. I mean, I think it is hard to keep track of because, as you said, it's easy to just file a FOIA, and I think we all get a little excited and then sometimes throw them out there and see what happens. But if you don't follow up, then it's very unlikely they'll be fruitful. So the organization's important.
Absolutely. And lastly, Sarah, I wanted to ask you, I think a tough thing dealing with kind of knowing that you have a steep hill to climb to secure some documents, especially from agencies that you know are tough to you know hand over what they have, and that you know that there is kind of this incoming battle to secure what you want. How do you manage those expectations, and how do you uh, stop yourself from getting bummed out, overwhelmed, kind of like learned helplessness when it comes to this shit? Like, does it feel like you're hitting your head on a brick wall, or do you have some sort of kind of like tips as to not feel uh, like you're just engaging in like a useless endeavor?
Well, there's good days and bad days. But I do really think one of the most beautiful things about doing FOIA and transparency work is the community, because everyone, events like this, or everyone is so dedicated to transparency and openness and sharing of information. There's so much solidarity and really nerdy jokes to be made about, the FOIA Friday hashtag on Twitter, where people show their like fully redacted documents, I think is really fun. And also, I think if you are persistent, you do get results, and that is exciting. Or, I submitted a FOIA recently, and the agency didn't respond to me, but who I assume was a rogue FOIA officer, wrote me back an anonymous letter being like, you need to look for this. And so that kind of stuff is always really exciting too. So I think in terms of managing expectations, that can be a really tough part. I know there's a different panel right now about FOIA for organizers, but I think working in coalition and using FOIA as a tool to get information for coalition efforts, that can be really, really, really challenging, because you don't want to make promises that you can't deliver on and all of that. But I think, just being really explicit with your partners from the get-go about the normal timeline of these things and not expecting a quick fix is the way to go.
I feel like that can be super frustrating in both of our professions, just given that all of our work is about timeliness for the most part. So we need answers quickly. And so not having them quickly is difficult at times. And I think even when we're writing these stories about when they are people centered, like it was a lot of times when Florian would reach out or his daughter would reach out, who was our main contact, and say like, what's the holdup? What's going on? Why can't we get this information faster? And I think explaining that while this should be very public and easy to access, it's not, and setting expectations in that way can sometimes like help ease that tension a little bit. But still, like Adriana mentioned, having that line in your story of I reached out and received no response can sometimes just be the only thing that you're able to get.
Yeah, and if I could add to that as well, I think that knowing that not having this data very accessible or not getting it at all is also can be part of the story, if not the story itself. And so that's kind of the situation that happened, as we said, with this story, and as well as other Borderless magazine stories. I can link another story where FOIAing was like kind of the center point of the article, and how getting that information or not getting the information, just that topic itself can be the talking point for a story as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. What story is that? Oh, you just linked it.
Yeah, I just think sorry.
Yeah. Talk to us about that story.
So this is a story that another reporter wrote. So I wasn't a part of this story, but just looking at how a FOIA victory kind of was the center point of the story.
Gotcha. Yeah, fantastic. I need to read this. Very cool. I appreciate you all making some fantastic points so far, and I just want to reiterate again for the viewers, if you have any questions, so you can feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll get back to them in a little bit. I think we'll start Q&A in about 5 minutes. But I did want to ask Adriana, Chelsea, given that this was like an initial foray for you all and kind of FOIAing and immigration and stuff, how are you thinking about using FOIA in the future now that you've kind of dipped your toes in?
Yeah, so I'm currently, like I said, like a data fellow with US News and World Report. I'm not specifically working on immigration anymore. It's more of a broader topic. So I think just moving forward, working on stories where I'll be requesting data that I can't get immediately from data sets that are available online. I think that as I continue my career, I am shifting from reporting to data journalism. I can totally see myself working with sources and trying to get that, like I said, those databases.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many questions that come from all of this, like Adriana said, when you don't get responses, the mishandling of reports and records, and how that directly correlates to how they're treating the inmates and the detainees that they're responsible for. Because especially with this story, like the COVID numbers represented real people having real struggles with COVID and like deaths in many cases, and that's really troubling and definitely something I want to keep digging into. And with the Illinois centers closing, you know, there's so many more questions open there. Where all the detainees moving to? What's going to happen to them? I think there's just a ton more that we can investigate here.
Absolutely, 100% agree. I personally for sure want to. It's a goal of mine for this year to engage in more FOIA work and to produce stories out of FOIA work. Because I think I felt or like I was like overwhelmed and kind of just bummed out by the kind of sheer what seemed like a Herculean task to secure this stuff, and so I kind of like let them win in some way. But to all of your points today, I think persistence is key, and I particularly enjoy the point about community. You know, like so that you don't feel as you're stumbling in the dark alone so much. Um, Last question here before we move into a Q&A. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, what kind of stuff do you wish, because you know you're the non-reporter here, and I'm always curious to hear what people who aren't journalists would want to see journalists do more. And so I want to ask you that. Like, how do you think journalists should employ FOIA, particularly when it relates to immigration issues, um, more in the public sphere?
Oof, that's a great question because I honestly often feel like it should be the reverse of journalists, you know, lawyers kind of showing up for journalists to litigate requests because they're the, you know, you all are the ones kind of actually sharing the information with the public and going through it and everything. Oh yeah, we did lose Adriana. But in general, I think one area that is, I mean, there is a good amount of coverage of this, but I think one area that I'm really interested in that I would love to see more pushing in is the sort of the ways that private contractors are involved in all these immigration functions. I mean, that's really, really difficult for all of us because, as some of you may know, the Supreme Court a couple of years ago issued a decision on one of the FOIA redactions that essentially really broadened its scope to cover a lot of things related to private contractors like Geo Group and CoreCivic and all of those guys. But I would love to collaborate more with journalists and with other advocates to figure out how to circumvent some of those issues, because DHS in particular has moved so much of its functioning to the private contractors and the subcontractors, again, I think on purpose to evade their FOIA obligations, among other accountability mechanisms. So I would love to work with journalists more on that.
Right. Very good. Yes, I agree. It's very troubling how so much of how things work is kept from public view. Maybe that's for good reason, I suppose, on their end. But yeah, I agree. Cool. Well, I'm scrolling up, hoping to see some questions. Going into the Q&A tab here. Got one question from Anonymous. Do you get the sense that, and this is the question, do you get the sense that ICE is evasive, like that ICE's evasiveness is intentional? If so, do you think that they have been directed to try to avoid providing information? Is it a staffing issue? Um, yeah, curious to hear your thoughts. I think the cynical side of me would say yes, but at the same time, I also know that human endeavors are never as easy as we think they are, and so it might just be a combination of the fact that they might have some value in trying to hide things, uh, but at the same time, it might just be that they're just understaffed. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I can offer from my experience. As Adriana said, we are often told to like lead with attempting to create relationships more so with people at the at least local level. So if we can get someone on the phone and say, look, these are the stories we've reported on. We're not trying to write a hit job. We're actually trying to get to the bottom of this. We often get positive responses, or at least a response. And that's not always easy. You know, you can't always get someone on a phone. You can't always make someone respond to your email. But in those instances, I don't think that it's intentional that anyone's trying to hide the information. But it also depends on the information, because there are definitely people that would probably not want to relay certain very touchy subjects. But then on the other hand, you have people that are purposefully directed to just like not give reporters information in general. So I have had those cases where, I mean, for instance, when we asked for the average daily population, that's not something that you can't disclose, you know, on the local level. That's definitely not something that you would always necessarily have to FOIA for. But the person that told me that they weren't able to disclose that was basically told no information to reporters whatsoever. And I think the lack of trust between these facilities and reporters breeds that, but there's definitely other reasons too. And I think it's pretty problematic generally.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, it's just like structurally, it kind of presents all these challenges from trying to look at what's available online and seeing that there are no historic records, that it's just a daily updated website that, of course, is going to have its issues. It's going to have its, troubles come up as far as like how numbers are being reported. It's not going to be 100% accurate. There are going to be mistakes. But again, like if that transparency was available and like very able to access on the website, then like that wouldn't require us to then ask for more questions and ask for more information. As well as when I do submit questions or do request data and I get a single sentence statement back, or half of my questions weren't really answered, then it kind of still creates this like furthermore like challenge. And so I wouldn't say that there's somebody behind the computer saying like I don't want to give this information out, but I'm sure that it's the structural issue of the data not being available, the way that they're responding not being very clear. I would say, I think another tip, if I could put another tip out there, is when you are asking questions, one of the things that I was doing is kind of asking in a yes or to garner a yes or no response. But I think that asking a question in the form that would require a statement or an explanation rather than just somebody being able to say yes or no is kind of a way to kind of get that potential quote or potential explanation that's more than just a single word. So that's the tip that I would have, that kind of requires them to tug and pull a little bit more information out if possible.
For what it's worth, to add to all of that, I think there is definitely intentionality in it. The way I approach thinking about this is that I think in the lowest level employees, it's often a mix of like powerlessness and incompetence. And then the higher up you get, I think it's more sinister. For example, I've seen emails both from FOIA and in civil discovery, which has kind of less restrictions. So I get to see more, of people explicitly trying to avoid FOIA obligations and how to get around certain things. And I mean, we play that game too, right? Like they're just playing the game, but their game is structured intentionally to be able to do that because it's the laws that are passed by Congress with all the lobbyists and all of that. And so I do think that from the top down, there's definitely a level of intentional opacity.
Yeah, I think that point and Adriana's previous point, I think really kind of brings into focus for me the lack of accountability on all sides here. Like there's no one's gonna get in trouble because someone only answered 3 of your 10 questions. No one's gonna get in trouble because they're willfully trying to hide something from a journalist. It's like I think also impacts all of this, and because they're essentially policing themselves in a lot of ways. Like these, and so there's no I was really disturbed when I was writing the story about the ICE detention contracts ending in Illinois, and trying to figure out where ICE was moving the 30 or so people left there in the last week of those detention contracts being upheld, and they wouldn't tell me. Like, and if like, they wouldn't tell me where they were moving people. They wouldn't tell me how many people they were moving. They wouldn't tell me how many people they had in general, and it just felt like pulling teeth. And I'm like, I've dealt with Cook County, the sheriff's office. I've dealt with CPD, and they'll at least tell me, like, yo, yeah, we're moving this person here, or like the Illinois prison system, like, oh yeah, we have this person here, or they're gonna get transferred here. Not saying those agencies are perfect, but at least you get a response on some very basic questions as to when it comes to people who are in custody. And ICE would not capitulate. They would not say anything, and that felt really disturbing and sad because I knew that no one's going to get in trouble for that. It's really sad that that's the way things operate. And I think perhaps we have a question here that kind of, I think, ties into this. The question is, what would you change about FOIA? What updates would be helpful for journalists and lawyers? And I'll take the freedom to expand that question as to how can FOIA as the law be improved, and then also how do we make these agencies more accountable to these kind of expectations of providing what should be publicly available information?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say is just, I guess, education on FOIAing, exactly what we're doing now, and just kind of letting people know that it's a right that exists out there, as well as, like I said earlier on in the conversation, is just this FOIAing is at its core just asking for information that is publicly available. And so it can come in the form of a very complicated document that you have to fill out on a specific website for an organization like ICE, or it can be, if you're a journalist or working already with somebody within the organization, like a PIO that you have contact with, or it can just be reaching out to whatever media email at the very bottom of the website that you're looking on. So I think as an early career journalist, I think it's a little bit, it feels like you're doing a lot, or it feels like it's a big document that you're going to have to type out and send to an entity, but it doesn't need to be that complicated. And I think just the more that you are able to do it, that it would.
No, case of the frozen Zoom. Dang. Adriana, if you can still hear us, you're frozen. Very sorry. Oh, she might be back. Yeah. Ugh. Pandemic world.
Okay, sorry, am I back on?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
I don't know where that cut off. Sorry, guys.
All good. We've all been there. Yeah. Curious to hear if Sarah or Chelsea have any thoughts on that point. How can FOIA be improved, and how can we hold these people accountable to follow the law?
I think that, as someone said earlier, every time they don't respond, they're breaking the law. And I want to see and they just get away with it all the time with this type of case more than any other type of litigation that I ever deal with. And so I would really like to see kind of higher consequences for agencies that don't respond to FOIA requests. I don't know, we have all these tools in litigation about sanctioning entities or other attorneys or whatever. And so I would love to see some actual sanctions baked into the law for FOIA reform. I think too, there's a lot of digital information, and as technology evolved, that FOIA is not written to encompass. And even though there have been periodic reforms to adapt to new technology. I think the last one was in 2006. And so there is stuff a lot of the time, we have trouble getting stuff that's not just a simple PDF format. So that is troublesome. And then the redactions are another big thing. Like I already mentioned this B4 case that's been the bane of my existence. It's so infuriating the way that has been interpreted. And then I know there's a question in the chat too about the privacy exemptions, and those have been really expanded. And I mean, that ends up because those are judicially created and interpreted. So that also ends up kind of, dovetailing into the larger problem of the state of our federal court system and the judges who have been appointed. But I think those are the areas that I would hit.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned this, but having that tagline in your story of "I reached out and I received no response" is, first of all, your due diligence that you actually are acknowledging that you put in that effort, but also it's holding them accountable in a sense of saying they didn't take the time to even get back to me on this. I always think that's, when I read that in a story, I can tell that the reporter has done, the work that I would assume that they would be doing. And I think that that's a good way to hold people accountable, especially if you can name an individual or a person that you've actually contacted that had no time to respond, if that's the case.
Thank you all for some very, very insightful comments and thoughts. I learned a lot over the last hour, and I'm sure the folks who have tuned in also learned a lot. We have about 5-6 minutes left. If anyone has a burning question that they've been typing out, please do so. Would hate for it to get cut off. In the meantime, I think I'll ask one final question from my end. I'm curious to hear if any of you have had the chance to attend any of the other panels, and if you could shout out something that you've seen at FOIA Fest and / direct folks, because I know all of these are going to get recorded, so definitely want to give folks a chance to go back and see some that maybe they missed.
I've not had the chance to attend any sessions yet, but I am planning on attending some later this afternoon. There was one session that's actually at the same time as this one that I was excited to see, but I'll be watching it once it's recorded, sent out.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at to tune into the other sessions. I would say that I'm looking into getting any type of template that I can, as far as I just love to have something pre-written and before sending something out. Just to kind of go back to our previous question, as far as challenges and things that it could be better. I think my idea of the perfect response to a FOIA would be a very nice and neat Excel document where everything is already categorized, and I don't have to copy and paste from a PDF or a website, or it's more than just 2 sentences worth of response. So the way that I approach to get those responses is usually, like I said earlier, to be very clear in what I'm asking for, clear in my deadline, and clear in even the format that I want it in. If I have to spell out that, if you could please list it by date in an Excel file that should be however many cells long or anything like that, is how I've kind of approached that. So I would be very interested in getting into any type of template or FOIA format that I could utilize in the future.
Yeah, I love those templates too. As someone who did not go to journalism school, they've been really helpful. I think we have. I don't know. Yes. No more questions. Yeah, as someone who did not go to journalism school, those templates were a savior so many times. But yeah, I think this has been a wonderful discussion, a perfect use of my Saturday afternoon, and I'm sure most folks here feel the same. I invite you all, if you tuned in late, please go back and watch the replay. I think the entire hour was very engaging and useful. I certainly learned a lot. But yeah, thank you to our wonderful panelists. I'm going to give them the last few minutes to see if they have any final thoughts on this issue. I think for me, after today, I think it's been very clear that that while it is a tough thing, and it like FOIAing for these federal agencies can be very daunting and tough, it's still very necessary, and also still relatively successful. I think today I think the optimism today is infectious, and that's good. And I did want to get to Leslie's question too. Sorry, Leslie, I just didn't tell. But I know we mentioned earlier the private information exemptions. Any tips on how we can avoid those privacy information exceptions, or maybe perhaps how do we tailor a request so as to not get caught in those pitfalls for private information exceptions?
I can speak to this a little bit. I've actually litigated this issue at the Ninth Circuit and have rabbit holed very hard on it. Essentially, I think, so the privacy exemptions, as you may already know, are both B6 and B7C are the two main ones, and they are both balancing tests. And so the legal standard is that, of course, there's a privacy interest in certain information, but the courts are supposed to weigh the public interest in the disclosure of information versus the privacy interest that is infringed upon for release of the information. So when I think some of those are just really hard to get around. And in the past, I've done stuff like, okay, you won't give me names of these agents accused of misconduct. What about unique identifiers in lieu of names? Can you replace them so you're not infringing the privacy, but I can still kind of track patterns in the data that I'm getting? But also in my requests, when I anticipate running into those exemptions, I make sure to really, really spend time articulating the public interest in disclosure to at least build a record of having asserted that interest for the purpose of the balancing test.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think that the tracker, the identifying tracker point is very key. I've definitely fallen into that pitfall where I was not able to build patterns because I did not have the identifier. That does suck.
Yeah. And they're not they're not obligated under FOIA to create new records. And so sometimes they won't want to do that for you. But if you're annoying enough, then sometimes they'll do it just so you go away. So that's another, reason to be persistent.
Hell yeah. I think that's a perfect point to end. Be annoying, please. Do not be afraid of being annoying. Yeah, sorry again, Leslie, for not seeing. For some reason, my chat window wasn't scrolling. I think we got through it all, guys. It's been a 1 hour. Last minute here. I just want to say thank you again, and see you at the next session.
Thanks, Carlos. This has been great. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.
Thanks all.
Bye.